I'm going to announce our next speaker, and then Lee Stenke will return as our host. For Foundation for the Future, thank you so much for letting me come on as a guest host today. It's been a privilege and an honor, and I've had a great time. Look forward to the rest of the talks today. Our next speaker is Dr. Namrata Goswami, who is an independent scholar on space policy, great power politics, and ethnic conflicts. After relocating to the US from India, she established her own strategy and policy consultancy. Dr. Goswami won the Minerva Grant awarded by the Office of the US Secretary of Defense to study great power competition in the gray zone of outer space. Dr. Goswami testified before the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission on China's space program, and is a resource partner for the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies, NATO Partnership for Peace Consortium, the Emerging Security Challenges Working Group specifically. She's also co-author of the book Scramble for the Skies, the Great Power Competition to Control the Resources of Outer Space. Dr. Goswami is widely published, including in The Diplomat, The Economist, The Economic Times, The Washington Post, Ad Astra, Asia Policy, Live Encounters Magazine, and Cairo Review. Currently, she's working on a book on space power theory and China. Dr. Goswami, welcome. Glad to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
And Dr. Goswami, I believe do you have the ability to share screen, or here, maybe I need to make you co-host?
Yes, I have the ability to share.
Excellent.
So can you see my screen? It should be up there.
Looks good.
Okay, great. So today in the about 20 minutes that I have, I'm going to speak on space logistics, and I've been advised by the organizers to speak more from a Asia-Pacific perspective. And so before I go into the specific Asia-Pacific perspective, I think it's interesting to note that if you look at what is happening in space today, it is mostly driven by, of course, what is happening in the US as well, and China to a very large extent at the systemic level, which is the level of international relations. So in the last few years, what we have seen is that there is an emphasis coming out of the US on space logistics, the topic of discussion today. And this has been pushed and supported by policy documents to include the Commercial Space Launch Competitive Act that was signed into law by President Obama in 2015. Under former President Trump, you saw an emphasis to return to the moon. And what is strikingly different from the Cold War is that it's about a permanent, sustainable presence. And there are several policy documents that support this particular stand. I know that Laura is speaking after me, and she's going to speak in detail about the US program. So one of the countries that is investing heavily in terms of space logistics, infrastructure, and policy is, of course, China. And one of the rockets that they are investing in is called the Long March 5, which is already functional today. It's an expendable rocket, but what is different from earlier rockets is that it's able to lift about 25 tons to low Earth orbit and about 14 tons to geostationary orbit. Now, this is over 2 times the capacity of previous Chinese rockets. Now, what is interesting is that most of the, missions that we have seen, to include the lunar sample return mission that we saw successfully demonstrated last year in December, and the Mars mission that had a first landing for China, which basically demonstrated all 3 missions at the same time to include orbiting, landing, and sending out a rover, was launched on the Long March 5. Now, what is important and critical in terms of space logistics coming out of Asia is that China is investing in reusability as well. And one of the aim is to make the Long March 8 reusable, which has been demonstrated already, and to repeat some of the capacity that the Falcon 9 has to include the ability to vertically land on a sea-based platform. Some of China's private companies are also investing in reusability. And you can see that the China Academy of Space Launch Technology, as well as the China Academy of Aerospace Development, both are also investing in reusable rockets. And the aim is to demonstrate this capacity by 2028. Now, one of China's workhorses by 2030 is, of course, the Long March 9, which has a capability to lift about 140 metric tons to low Earth orbit. Now, this is an expendable rocket, it's not reusable, but they aim and hope to manufacture several of them, about 30 a year, to help them launch the space logistics system. For example, an ability to go to cislunar space, which is a space between Earth and Moon. Now, I point out this because it's critical to understand that if you look at China's long-term goals in terms of logistics, they are thinking in terms of an end-to-end transportation system. And in that, their permanent space station plays a critical role as well that they launch this year. Now, we already know that China has two launch sites, and the Jiuquan Satellite Launch Center is the oldest rocket launch center. But the launch center in Hainan Island, which is closer to the equator, is what is going to become the critical launch center for missions to Moon, Mars, geosynchronous orbit. And we can see that they've also developed one of the most critical logistics capability, which is cargo transfer to their Tiangong space station, which again, they have successfully demonstrated in the last few years. Now, this is something new, which I did not present in my last presentation here, and that is that China is now developing a human landing system. So they demonstrated this capacity and already tested it last year in May, where they sent up the module and it came back to Earth intact. So some of the capacities that they are investing in terms of space logistics is not just sending human crew, but they also tested 3D printing, which is important in terms of in-space manufacturing. They tested the effect of radiation, especially the effect of radiation when you're going to the moon. And what is different in this particular landing system, which is aimed for the moon. So the earlier systems were only for low Earth orbit, supported by the Sanjiao rocket. But this is different. So this particular module is going to take about 6 to 9 taikonauts, which is Chinese astronauts, to the moon in the next 15 years. That's the plan. So you can see that they are starting to demonstrate that capability and have also set deadlines. Now, this year on April 24th, all of us got to see the video that the China Academy of Launch Vehicle Technology in their booth showed, which is a rocket which looked very similar to the Starship. Now, however, this particular rocket, in terms of the interviews and the slideshow that is available on Weibo, demonstrates is different in a sense because it's not an interplanetary rocket that they're planning in the next 20 years. The deadline is 2040. But this is a suborbital rocket that plans to go from one point of Earth to another. An example could be a launch, say, from Shanghai to New York. I know that SpaceX is also hoping to develop such a system. And the basic idea is to be able to go in terms of cargo from one area to the other in the next 15 years within an hour, which is going to really improve China's economic prospects. But in the next 15 years, to actually take human beings from one end of, say, a Chinese city to, say, a city in the US or in Latin America within 36 minutes. So you can see that they are investing in this capacity. The rocket is very, it's shining like the Starship, but has a much more limited goal. And it's not really focused on interplanetary missions like the Starship is focused on today. Now, China's space station, which is part of their logistics and infrastructure, and I say this because if you look at the articulations coming out of China's scientists, especially the head of the mission, they have not seen this as an end goal in itself. So China's space station is, of course, much smaller than the International Space Station. It can host about 3 astronauts for 6 months, and during transfer, about 6 astronauts. Now, this is interesting. So one of the mission goal identified by Li Ming, who's the Director General of the China Academy of Space Technology, is that the space station is a means to develop logistics capability to then go to the moon. It is at an equatorial plane, about 41 to 43 degrees versus 51.6 degrees to the ISS, which makes it advantageous for it to send missions to the moon. And so what you can see is that they are thinking in terms of long-term space transportation. And one of the experiments that the space station hopes to test is, of course, power beaming, and a facility and an ability that will then help them to use similar capabilities, say, on the moon. Now, one of the other logistics that I saw, which again is something that hasn't been discussed much in the US media, is that the national satellite mega constellation of China is going to be about 12,992 satellites in low Earth orbit, as per filings with the International Telecommunication Union. It just was announced last month. They have given it a name. And so the idea is that by 2022, they're going to launch about 60 Huang satellites. And what is, again, important is that this particular satellite constellation, not very different from Starlink, is going to become China's critical infrastructure in support of in-space logistics, communication, and transportation, as well as satellite internet on Earth. And unlike the United States, the China National Development and Reform Commission has called satellite internet critical new infrastructure. Now, I just wanted to demonstrate a bit in terms of the capacity of the different launch systems that we are comparing. And the Long March 9, as you see, is high up in the radar there. It's about 140 metric tons to low Earth orbit. And the idea is to launch to low Earth orbit and then to utilize in-space facility or logistics to then go to the moon. And so this particular perspective has been supported in terms of long-term planning, resources, and end goals for China. Now, coming to India, we know that India also has good launch capacity. It's developing a second spaceport here, which is very close to the equator again. And India also has expendable rockets and one of the cheapest launch system. And it's actually also focusing on developing reusability. Now, the focus on reusability is critical for both China and India, of course, taking example from SpaceX and Blue Origin. But what is interesting is that if you look at the goals that especially China has articulated, it's about space presence, which is permanent. It's about mining. It's about lunar resources. And I'll speak to that a bit in the slides that follow. Japan is a very mature spacefaring country with a very advanced space system. And you can see it from this slide that they have rockets. They have the Tagashima Space Center, which is the largest rocket launch complex for Japan. And one of the interesting conversation coming out of the Japan-India collaboration is that both of them are going to collaborate in terms of resource prospecting on the moon, which means that both of them are going to invest in space logistics, space transportation, and the capacity to have permanent presence there. Japan, of course, is also a part of the Artemis Accord signed with the US. And so you can see that Japan is a very mature country in terms of looking at space logistics, solar power beaming. JAXA, the Japanese Aerospace Agency, was the first agency to demonstrate power beaming about 6 miles in length and hope to escalate that to a higher level. And then in terms of looking at the goals set by one of Japan's private company, which is iSpace, you can see that from the statement, their argument is that we've turned our attention to the moon. By taking advantage of lunar water resources, we can develop the space infrastructure needed to enrich our daily lives on Earth, as well as expand our living sphere into space. And iSpace recently signed a MOU with JAXA to collaborate and advance this together. Now, one of the reasons why all of them are focused, for example, on the moon, as all of us know, especially this audience, is that there is the discovery of water ice on the lunar surface. And the idea is that the water ice is going to be absolutely essential if you want to develop capacity to go to the moon, as well as to establish lunar presence there. Now, Olivia, before me, the speaker mentioned as to why the moon is advantageous in terms of establishing the space logistics infrastructure. And the argument coming out of China is that if you invest in a lunar capacity for example, research base, which they are establishing in collaboration with Russia, and you are able to establish a launch facility on the moon. The energy required to launch from the moon for deep space probes, including their mission to Mars, is going to be 22 times lesser in terms of energy use. And because the gravity well of the moon is much lower. And of course, the Lagrange points become very critical in terms of that logistics infrastructure. Now, some of the lead players in terms of looking at just lunar logistics and transportation is, of course, the US with the Artemis Accord and the collaboration that it's now establishing with about 9 countries, including Brazil. India is not part of the Artemis Accord, nor is China. China's lunar exploration program is, of course, one of the lead players in terms of space infrastructure, logistics, and developing lunar capacity. And China has recently collaborated with Russia. So in terms of the lunar geopolitics, this is something that I think we'll have to keep in mind as we go forward and look at how space logistics, infrastructure, and transportation is going to be developed. So as you can see from this slide, there are 2 conflicting alignments and visions here. Of course, we have the Artemis Accord, but recently, just this year, China and Russia signed a memorandum of understanding to develop a lunar logistics capability, especially presence on the moon by 2036. And so if you look at some of the missions that are in what we have to look forward to between the years, say 2007 to about 2036 from China, so you can see from this slide that these are what they are hoping to develop in terms of their space logistics and infrastructure. And what is interesting is that the investment for that has already started 10 years ago. So these are not new developments. Now, in the year 2021, you can see, I'm focusing on the moon here a bit because we are going to move away from geosynchronous orbit to becoming a cislunar spacefaring civilization. You can see that it's crowded. There are several missions that are planned. For example, Rocket Lab, of course, will launch NASA's cislunar autonomous positioning system. You have Artemis 1, which is planned for a crewless test flight. But you also have Luna 25 lander, which is Russia's lunar program that's going to launch in October this year for the first time in 45 years to send a flyover around the moon. And they're going to do this in collaboration with, of course, China. 2022, several missions again, and one of the mission that is going to invest in terms of resource prospecting, which is part of something to do in space, as Lee was mentioning the other day, to move something in space and to develop logistics. You have the Korea Pathfinder lunar orbiter by the Korea Aerospace Research Institute. So South Korea is also getting into the game of in-space infrastructure and logistics. Now, 2023, again, several missions are basically what we are going to look forward to in terms of developing that capacity. But again, the Chang'e 6 from the China National Space Administration is planning to bring back samples from the lunar South Pole in service of their long-term goal in terms of identifying where the base should be, what is the most advantageous area. And recently, on April 24th, the China National Space Administration presented what they're going to do in terms of lunar geopolitics itself. So I just wanted to offer you a slide-based representation because you can see that the investment in space manufacturing, where the base should be, how human beings are going to be sustained using lunar resources. These are very advanced concepts that are in conversation across the world. So it's not just the US. You can see that Roscosmos Luna 26 is a lunar polar orbiter, part of the Lunar Globe program by Roscosmos, with science objectives to function as a telecom relay between Earth and Russian landed assets. And now, of course, they have joined in with the China Lunar Exploration Program, basically with the desire to establish an alternate alignment of alliances and partnerships. And so I'll move over to the next slide. And so I wanted to focus a bit on Russia's space capacity building as well. And so just this year, President Putin gave a speech on the 60th anniversary of Yuri Gagarin's flight to the first man to go to space. And he pointed out that one of the investment for Russia today is that it's going to be the moon. And so you can see how they have adopted with the Chinese perspective, and which is that if you want to become serious in terms of developing your in-space manufacturing capacity, your ability to support human beings on a surface outside of Earth, the first place to look to is the moon. And what is interesting is that they have come to the realization that you have to collaborate in terms of developing that capacity, and they have all these missions planned for the next few years. So I'll end by saying that if you look at what is happening, there are three things that are coming out from this particular insights in the last few years. And it's astounding, which is that both China and Russia and India, to an extent, are looking at an Earth-Moon future in the next 15 years. So what they hope to establish, especially coming out of the Russian and Chinese conversation, is to be able to sustain human beings on the moon by 2036. They have the timeline is 2036, 2040. And once you establish that capacity and are able to manufacture resources on the moon, for example, using water ice for nuclear, for fuel, helium-3 for nuclear fusion is another focus of theirs. And both Russia and China are now talking about establishing a nuclear propelled space logistics infrastructure. You know that Russia just announced recently an investment on a nuclear tug, and China, of course, has been investing in developing nuclear propulsion based spacecrafts by 2040. And what is the end goal of almost all their mission is not what happened in the Cold War. So it's not about sending human beings for a few days on the moon and bringing them back. Both of them are articulating ambitions for establishing permanent presence, using space-based resources, including space-based solar power, to support such facilities beyond geo, and to use those capacity to then become what is critical for from their perspective to go to Mars, and then utilize the amazing asteroid belt that exists there. So they have a very long-term focus in terms of going step by step and not doing everything at the same time, because of their realization that space has a lot to offer in terms of economy, as well as an ability to use those resources to become a truly spacefaring civilization. So I think I'm going to end there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Nami. It's always wonderful to hear your comments. I noticed early in your talk you mentioned that China has named space as a critical infrastructure, which the US has not yet done, in spite of a lot of conversations around that. Can you talk a little bit about that designation and what it means for China, as well as what it would mean for the US?
Surely. So in April 2020, under President Xi Jinping's direction in terms of what should be the area of focus in the next 20 years for China, China's national, as I mentioned, National Development Reform Commission highlighted space as a critical infrastructure, including 5G and satellite internet. Now, what that means in terms of policy consequences are three things. One, that space is going to receive investment as a highest priority, especially some of the goals that they've identified, including investment in space-based solar power, in-space manufacturing, and lunar resource capacity. Second, it's going to become a critical component of what President Xi hopes to inspire across the world, and that is in 2049, China will be celebrating the 100th year anniversary of its establishment, and it wants to do it in a spectacular way. So if you can demonstrate presence on the moon and you actually have Chinese taikonauts there, that is going to be impressive for the world in terms of permanent presence. And finally, what that means is that what President Xi is trying to instigate by utilizing space is to create STEM a desire for STEM, and to become the world leader in technologies like artificial intelligence, 3D printing, quantum. China, of course, leads in quantum today in the world with the first quantum satellite. And so those are the implications for China designating space as a critical infrastructure, high level of focus at the top level.
And how far along is China on the people side? How many people have they launched into space so far?
I don't have that number on the top of my head, but as part of their Sanzao mission, if I remember right, they sent about 3 taikonauts in 2016, and again another 3. So, but I cannot tell you the number out of the top.
Yeah, okay. So a long way to go, but they've shown consistent commitment to their plans starting a decade or 2 ago.
Yes, and I think the difference between the Chinese space program and the US space program is that they are not focused on sending humans to the moon at this point of time. So it's a very different program. So what their focus is, I mean, of course, they have sent humans to low Earth orbit, but not beyond that.
Yeah.
So the focus is that you first develop the robotic autonomous capacity. You invest in your ability to actually have advanced level of AI supported manufacturing in space, because without that, it will be very difficult for any country to sustain human beings for a longer term. So as I said, the focus of the 21st century Chinese space program is different from the 20th century US space program, which was about, and the Soviet Union space program, which was basically sending humans for a very short time to demonstrate that capacity for prestige purposes and reputation purposes and bring them back. If you listen to China's lead space scientists and policymakers, they argue that it is more critical to realize that the cislunar Earth-Moon space is going to become important in terms of economic perspective. So they have a much more longer term focus on using space for economic return of investment. You can see that in their assessment from their satellite internet, including Bao Wei-ming, who's one of their chief scientists of their space and missile program. He indicated in a speech last year that if you invest this amount of money by, say, 2050, the return of investment from that would be about $10 trillion, exponentially higher than what you invest in the beginning, and including their Beidou satellite. So it's a very different perspective of space.
Yeah, but those numbers are borne out by the experience of the value of satellites that we've already got in the air, right?
Yes, because if you listen to their assessment, for example, their Beidou navigation system, right? So when they established it, the cost was about $9 billion, but the China Navigation Satellite Center gave an assessment of how much they're earning annually, which is about $59 billion. So 9 billion investment, 59 return. And you can see that just satellite-based industry is exponentially rising, about 500 billion today, estimated to be about 1.2 trillion by 2030. And we are not even talking about space-based resources there.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure Raphael will tell us that 59 billion is a good investment. The 9 billion is a good investment to get the 59. Can I ask you to shift gears just a little bit and talk about the book that you recently published with Pete Garretson, Scramble for the Skies? I saw a great article by Greg Autry highlighting really that you and Pete had incorporated in your work key concepts that other similar works had missed. And so great praise from him there. Can you talk about whether the people who need to read the book are reading it? How has it been received among US policymakers? And then do you get noticed in Asia as well? And do you hear feedback from the other side of the globe?
So it got published last year in October. So usually a book takes about 6 months to become a critical read. I would say that it's catching up in the US and China. There are a lot of feedback in terms of looking at the book from Chinese websites where they recommend the book as well. And of course, it's not translated into Mandarin, but they give a review of that. I would say that what that book did, which is different, is that for the first time, the book actually offers you a clear methodology in terms of how a conversation, say, for example, on space resources that we are doing now, which is an epistemic level conversation for space advocates and those who believe in this particular concept and are investing in it, how that conversation moves in a particular country from just in the epistemic level to then becoming influencing in terms of policy articulation. And from that step, actually being reflected in policy documents and then the implementation of it.
Yeah.
So, right. And the effect of that. And so what the book does is that it offers you a case by case perspective of the US, China, India, UAE, and Luxembourg, which are new emerging middle powers in space. And finally, actually what Peter and I do, which I think your audience would find interesting, is that we offer different futures in terms of how the timelines proceed. So for example, if you invest in, say, a lunar capacity today, what is the ultimate effect of that? If you do not invest in it, what is the future that you're going to face, right? So it gives you those interesting future scenarios as well.
Great. Well, Nami, we really appreciate your time, and I'm excited to see you back for our panel early this afternoon. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you for having me. It's an honor.